Should we just reflect for a few minutes about Iran, you mentioned? I think a lot of people here would have found it quite striking over the last week where we saw the Iranian president going on a shopping spree in Rome and Paris, buying up jets and other things. And we had the Iranian foreign minister here speaking in parliament and speaking at a very well-respected think tank. I like to call it a charm offensive. They were very charming, and a lot of people found it offensive. So something has changed, where you have the Iranian foreign minister addressing, peers and MPs in the House of Parliament, and they're saying that they want to grow the relationship with Britain, but they will continue to support what they call non-state actors in the region. So how has the nuclear deal and what's going on in Syria, how has that changed things? Like, people talk about a Middle East that has, shifted in Iran's favor, and now it can succeed in its kind of bid for hegemony in the region, and the only person standing in the way is Saudi Arabia, and they're not up to the job. But your thoughts on that?
I think the agreement with Iran has, various sides to it. One side to it is indeed the enhancement of Iran's capacity to pursue its regional ambition, because it has improving relations with the West, including the United States. Looking at Arab weakness, it seems as if the Americans have come to the conclusion that, considering Arab weakness, perhaps Iran is a player and a partner in organizing the Middle East rather than the problem. That maybe Iran is part of the solution rather than part of the problem, as the Israelis and the Saudis would see it. And I think there is a certain gap here between the present US administration and some of its allies in the Middle East. The windfall of sanctions relief, if this is $100 billion or $150 billion, however much it may be, obviously makes the Iranians very, very attractive buyers of all the goodies that Western industrialized nations can sell them, and that the Iranians are desperate to buy after so many years of inability to buy such weaponry, etc. And that does make Iran's pursuit of hegemonic superiority or regional hegemony more of a possibility. But the agreement has its good sides also. And what I think Israel has, if you look at Israel, that is what the Prime Minister was saying, is not exactly what people in the Israeli defense establishment think. There is a certain discrepancy between the way Netanyahu presented the Iranian agreement and the way the Israeli military talks about it. There is a 10 to 15 year hiatus, at least according to the agreement, in the development of Iran's nuclear weaponry capability. No military campaign by Israel, or anybody else for that matter, could have secured a 10 to 15 year postponement of this program. Maybe a year or 2 or 3, but not 15, and not 10. So there is, I would say, a more complex way of looking at this agreement. It doesn't only have a downside. In theory, one could say, if one wants to be really very optimistic about it, I myself wouldn't go that far, but there are those who do think this way, that if relations between Iran and the United States continue to improve, that eventually maybe relations between Israel and Iran would shift. In the meantime, that is not the case, and there is no indication that that might be the case. And here some things are changing in a way that is a cause for Israeli concern. And this is the civil war in Syria. All these questions that we're talking about, if it's ISIS or Iranian hegemonic design or the civil war in Syria, are all interrelated in one way or another. Iran has huge interests in Syria. Essentially, the Syrian civil war is the arena of the Sunni Shiite strategic struggle. Whoever wins in Syria will win a major battle in the historical struggle between Sunnis and Shiis. Therefore, the Saudis and the Iranians are pitted against each other in the civil war in Syria. And in Israel, for quite some time, there was a question: who do we want to win in Syria? Do we want Assad to win? Or do we want the rebels to win? And for a long time, people were saying in Israel, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. A plague on both of their houses. But now, I think the penny has dropped, so to speak, and people in Israel would prefer to see Assad lose. There was a time when people were saying, Assad is the devil we know. For all his faults, he has kept the peace with Israel for 40 years. Since May 1974, the agreement between Israel and Syria that put the Yom Kippur War behind us, we had no trouble with Syria. Only indirectly via Lebanon. But the Golan Front was quiet. And quite honestly, that's how Israel tends to judge its neighbors. Do they keep the quiet or don't they? Whether they're democratic or not, we do not feel is our business. And we don't involve ourselves in that question. Do they keep the peace with Israel or don't they? And we said Assad may not be a democrat, but 40 years and more of peace with Israel he has kept. Therefore, Assad for us is the devil we know. And not a bad one. But I think our minds on that have changed. It has become increasingly clear in the last few years that Iran sees Syria as a linchpin of its hegemonic design. There is no Shiite crescent without Syria. There is no connection between Iran and Hezbollah without Syria. An Iranian, a while back, I saw quoted as saying, Syria for us is our Stalingrad, just to suggest the importance that they attach to the struggle over Syria. If Iran loses in Syria, it is a huge setback for Iran strategically and for Hezbollah in particular. If the Iranians have their way in Syria, a situation will emerge where Hezbollah, after the war in Syria, if they are victorious, Hezbollah is fighting for Assad in Syria, paying a heavy price, losing a lot of men. But if Hezbollah returns after victory to Lebanon with more battle-hardened soldiers, with more military experience, and the victory in Syria in their belt, we may face a Hezbollah-Iranian front which will include Lebanon and the Golan Front with Syria. That we don't want. That for us is dangerous.